He fired a single bullet into the Montana sky and begged God for someone, anyone. 2 days later, a freight wagon rolled into his yard carrying an unconscious woman, a letter addressed to the wrong brother, and the answer to a prayer he had not yet dared to believe in. Now here is how that story began. She lay unconscious among sacks of flour and crates of supplies in the back of a freight wagon, her face pale as bone china, and covered in a sheen of sweat, her navy blue dress worn and powdered with the red dust of Montana Territory. The freight driver said she had been walking through the high desert of Montana in the punishing heat of October, with nothing but a small traveling bag clutched to her chest. The letter tucked inside her bodice bore a name, Caleb Calloway. But Caleb was not the one who carried her inside. The man who lifted her from that wagon bed, who laid her gently on his own bed and pulled his mother's quilt over her trembling body, who sat beside her through the long fever darkness and would not leave, was Silas. And from that moment forward, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit subscribe. I share New Frontier stories every week. And drop a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. Now let me take you back. 2 days before that wagon rolled into the yard, 2 days before everything changed, the gunshot shattered the evening silence and sent every bird within a mile scattering into the darkening Montana sky. Silas Calloway stood in the dusty yard of the log cabin he and his brothers had built with their own hands. The revolver still pointed at the heavens, a thin ribbon of gun smoke curling upward into the cold October air. He had just fired a single round straight into the sky while shouting a prayer to God that he desperately hoped anyone would hear. His hands trembled as he lowered the weapon. Silas was not a religious man, had never really been one, but lately he found himself talking to the empty sky more often than he cared to admit, talking to it because there was no one else to talk to, because the silence on this mountain had become so thick and so heavy that some nights it pressed down on his chest until he could barely draw breath. At 28 years old, Silas Calloway had built something real on the slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains, a 5-room cabin of hand-split pine and riverstone, a barn that could shelter 6 horses through the worst of winter, 40 head of cattle grazing on the steep meadows above the tree line, fence lines that stretched for miles across terrain so rough that every post had to be set by hand, every rail notched with an axe. He had done all of this through sheer force of will and the kind of back-breaking labor that turns a young man old before his time. But the achievement felt hollow because there was no one to share it with. No one sitting across from him at the dinner table. No one to hear about his day or tell him about theirs. No one whose presence in the house would make it feel like something more than a place where 3 men ate and slept and worked and waited for nothing in particular. His parents had died of a fever 5 years ago in the winter of 1873. The same winter, 2 weeks apart. His mother went first quietly in the small hours of a January morning. His father followed as though he had simply decided that a world without her was not a world worth inhabiting. Silas was 23 then. He was the one who dug the 2 graves in the frozen ground, swinging the pickaxe until his hands bled and the blisters split and froze. Josiah, 20 years old, stood watching in silence, his green eyes fixed on the dark earth as though memorizing something terrible. Caleb, just 17, wept openly and without shame. Since that winter, Silas had carried everything. The weight of 2 younger brothers who needed feeding and sheltering and guiding into manhood. The weight of a homestead that required constant labor just to keep from falling apart. The weight of decisions that no one else could make. Every board in these walls, every fence post on this mountain, every trail cut through the timber bore the mark of the Calloway brothers. But the heaviest thing Silas carried was the one no one could see. The loneliness. The bone-deep soul-grinding loneliness of a man who had built his world so that he needed no one, and then woke up one morning to discover that needing no one and wanting no one were 2 very different things. A man keeps his word, but Silas had never had anyone to make promises to except himself. Inside the cabin, Josiah sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle by lamplight. He looked up when Silas came through the door, those sharp green eyes reading everything in a single glance, but he said nothing. Josiah rarely needed to ask questions. He could read the truth in the set of a man's jaw, in the way someone held their shoulders, in the smallest shift of weight from one foot to the other. On the table beside him sat a small wooden carving, half-finished, a deer emerging from a block of pine. Josiah carved when he was worried, when the nightmares came, when his mind needed somewhere to hide from the memories that still woke him in the dark. Caleb came in from the barn trailing the scent of hay and horses, a wide grin spreading across his face despite there being nothing particular to smile about. That was Caleb, sunshine in a house full of shadows. "You shot at the sky again," Caleb said. Star nearly jumped clear over the fence. Star was his favorite mare. A wild Mustang he had broken himself 2 summers ago, patient and stubborn in equal measure, the way Caleb was with every animal he touched. He crossed the room and laid a hand on Silas's shoulder. An easy gesture, the kind of casual contact that only the youngest brother could get away with when dealing with a man as guarded as Silas Calloway. "You need sleep, Silas. You look like you got dragged behind a wagon." Silas did not answer. He hung the revolver on its peg, sank into the rocking chair beside the fireplace, the chair their father had built by hand from mountain ash, and stared into the flames. Outside, the last light of October bled from the sky, and the Bitterroot Peaks caught the final glow of sunset, their snow-capped summits burning amber and gold before the darkness swallowed them whole. The Calloway Ranch sat at 4,000 feet on the western slope of the Bitterroots, 15 miles of mountain road above the nearest town of Elkhorn. 15 miles of switchbacks and creek crossings, and narrow trails carved into granite. In summer, the ride took 3 hours. In winter, when the snow piled 6 feet deep and the wind came screaming off the Continental Divide, the ranch might as well have been on the moon. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles south. The nearest doctor was in Elkhorn when he was there at all, which was not often. It was beautiful country, the kind of beauty that could stop your heart. Pine forests so thick the sunlight came through in cathedral shafts. Creeks running cold and clear over beds of white stone, their water straight from the snowmelt above. Meadows of blue bunch wheatgrass that rippled like green oceans in the wind. Elk moving through the timber at dawn. Eagles circling overhead in slow spirals riding the thermals. Beautiful, and lonely enough to drive a man to fire his gun at the sky and beg God for an answer. What Silas did not know, what he would not learn for 2 more days, was that an answer was already on its way. And it was coming in the form of a 22-year-old woman from Boston, Massachusetts, who was at that very moment sitting on a stagecoach rattling across the Montana plains with $4 to her name, a letter from a stranger, and the desperate hope that the life she was running toward would be better than the one she was running from. But before we get to Clara Winslow and her journey west, there is something else you need to know. A secret, one that would change everything. 6 weeks before that gunshot prayer, Caleb Calloway had done something without telling anyone. He had written a letter, not to a friend, not to a relative, not to a business associate. He had written to a newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts, answering an advertisement in the mail-order bride section. He had used his own name. He had described the ranch honestly, the mountains truthfully, the isolation without sugarcoating. But he had written the letter with one specific purpose in mind. He was not looking for a wife for himself. He was looking for a wife for Silas. Caleb knew his eldest brother, knew him better perhaps than Silas knew himself. He knew that Silas would never write such a letter on his own. Too proud, too stubborn, too accustomed to loneliness to believe he deserved anything else, too afraid of rejection to risk the asking. But Caleb also knew that the loneliness was eating Silas alive from the inside, turning him into a harder and more brittle version of himself with each passing season, and if something did not change soon, Silas would become a shell, a man going through the motions of living without actually being alive. The letter Caleb wrote was careful, honest, warm in the way that Caleb was naturally warm, with an easy humor and a directness that made people trust him on instinct. "I will not promise you an easy life. Miss Winslow," the letter read, "Montana winters can kill a person, and a ranch in the mountains is not a tea parlor in Boston. But I promise you truth, respect, in a place where you will never need to pretend to be someone you are not. If that is good enough for you, then you are good enough for us." A woman named Clara Winslow had written back. Her letter was intelligent, sincere, and carried a depth of feeling that surprised Caleb. She wrote about books she loved, about wanting a life that meant something beyond mere survival, about the need to start fresh in a place where no one knew her name or her history. She did not sound desperate. She sounded determined, and that Caleb thought was exactly what Silas needed. The problem was that Clara was now on her way to Montana, and Caleb had not told Silas. He told Josiah. Late one night, while Silas slept, Caleb sat across from his middle brother at the kitchen table and laid out the whole plan. Josiah listened without interrupting, his hands still moving in their steady rhythm, as he cleaned the barrel of his rifle. When Caleb finished, Josiah was quiet for a long time. The kind of silence that from anyone else would have been uncomfortable, but from Josiah was simply the sound of thinking. Silas will lose his mind, Josiah said finally. I know. Another silence, then quieter. But you are right, he needs this. Josiah agreed to keep the secret. If Silas found out beforehand, he would write a cancellation letter so fast the ink would not have time to dry. Now let me tell you about Clara. She sat in the stagecoach as it rattled westward across the Montana plains, her small traveling bag clutched on her lap, her knuckles white around the handles. Everything she owned in this world was inside that bag. 2 changes of clothes, both practical. A book that had belonged to her mother, the pages soft as cloth from years of reading. The letter from Caleb Calloway. And $4. $4 between herself and absolute destitution. Clara Winslow was 22 years old. She had honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders in loose waves, partially pinned up in a modest style that was already coming undone in the dry wind. Her eyes were cornflower blue, large and expressive, framed by long, dark lashes. She had a heart-shaped face with delicate features, a small, straight nose, and full lips that were currently pressed together in a thin line of determination. She was small, 5'3", slender. The kind of build that people mistook for fragile until they saw the iron in her spine. She looked out the window at the vast emptiness of Montana and felt both liberated and terrified in equal measure. Every mile that carried her farther from Boston was a mile closer to freedom. But freedom, she was learning, looked an awful lot like nothing. No houses, no church steeples, no cobblestone streets. Just grass and sky in distance stretching to the edge of the world. Her parents had died when she was 19. Fever, the same kind of fever that took so many in the crowded streets of the city. They left her a small inheritance and nothing else. No family except a distant aunt who had moved west years ago. No prospects except the charity of strangers. The Harwell family of Boston took her in. She became a governess for their young children. A respectable position, a roof over her head. She should have been grateful. And she was, at first. But then Edward Harwell, the eldest son, decided he wanted her. Not the way a man wants a woman he loves, the way a man wants a painting for his wall, or a horse for his stable, something beautiful to own and display. He arranged the engagement without asking her opinion, the way he arranged everything with the quiet certainty of a man who had never been told no by anyone in his life. Clara, pressured by obligation and the suffocating weight of gratitude, agreed. For a while, but as the wedding approached, she saw the truth more clearly with each passing day. Edward did not want a wife. He wanted a possession, a decorative object that would smile and nod and never have an opinion about anything that mattered. And Clara Winslow, whatever else she was not an object. 2 months before the wedding, she broke the engagement. The Harwell family erupted. Ungrateful, they called her. Selfish. Foolish. Edward's reaction was colder, more precise, more frightening. No one walks out of my life until I say so, Clara, he said, his gray eyes flat and unblinking. You will regret this. She used the last of her parents' inheritance to buy passage west, answered the mail-order bride advertisement, and ran. Not just from Edward. From the version of herself that Boston wanted her to be. And now here she was, rattling toward a town called Elkhorn to meet a man named Caleb Calloway, praying that the words in his letter were true, praying that somewhere at the end of this journey there was a place where she could finally stop running and start living. The stagecoach broke an axle 15 miles east of Elkhorn. The driver cursed, climbed down, examined the damage, and delivered the verdict. A day at least to make repairs, maybe 2. Clara looked at the empty road stretching westward. 15 miles. In Boston, 15 miles meant passing through half a dozen towns and villages. Surely here it could not be so different. Surely she could walk it in a few hours. It was, she would later admit, the most foolish decision of her entire life. The October heat in Montana is a deceptive thing. Dry and relentless, the sun beating down from a sky so blue, it hurts to look at the wind hot and gritty with dust. Clara walked for 2 hours before the water she carried ran out. She walked for another hour in shoes made for Boston sidewalks, not Montana roads, feeling the blisters rise and burst on her heels. The landscape, which had seemed so vast and beautiful from the stagecoach window, now seemed hostile and endless. No shade, no water, no sign of human habitation in any direction. just grass and rock and scum. Her vision began to blur. Her legs felt heavy, as though she were walking through deep water. Her thoughts scattered like startled birds. And in that moment of desperation, Clara Winslow did something she had not done since the night her mother died. She prayed, "Please, God, give me one more chance. Let someone find me. Give me a place where I belong." Then the ground tilted sideways and she fell. Two prayers. Two strangers. One standing on a mountaintop shouting his loneliness at the sky. One lying face down in the dust of a Montana road. Neither knew the other existed. But sometimes prayers are answered in ways that no one expects. Tom Fisher found her. Tom was a freight driver who hauled supplies between towns along the Bitterroot Valley. He was a grizzled man in his 50s who had seen enough of the frontier to know trouble when it was lying unconscious in the middle of the road. He loaded Clara into the back of his wagon, checked her pulse, felt the fever burning through her skin, and made a quick calculation. The Callaway Ranch was the closest habitation. 7 miles. Doc Miller was out of Elkhorn, making calls to ranches up north, and would not be back for days. The freight wagon came roaring into the Callaway yard in a spray of gravel and dust. Tom was shouting before the wheels stopped turning. "Silas, thank God you are here. I need your help, and I need it now." Silas came running from the barn. He reached the wagon and looked into the bed, and there she was, lying among the flour sacks and supply crates, face white as paper covered in sweat, navy blue dress torn and filthy with dust, honey blonde hair tangled and plastered to her damp forehead and neck. She looked small. She looked broken. She looked like the answer to a prayer he had not yet dared to believe in. "Found her about 10 miles east," Tom explained quickly. "Collapsed on the side of the road. Walking, can you believe that? Walking through this heat with nothing but a small bag. Fever is bad. She needs water and rest, and she needs it now. Doc Miller is not in town. Your place was the closest. I figured you would help." Silas did not hesitate, not for 1 second. "Bring her inside." He climbed into the wagon bed and slid his arms beneath the unconscious woman to lift her. She was lighter than he expected, or perhaps the urgency made her seem so. He could feel the heat radiating from her body, the fever burning through the fabric of her dress. Her head fell against his shoulder as he carried her across the yard and through the door of his cabin. Josiah was already clearing the bed. Caleb was already fetching the water. "Put her on your bed," Tom directed. Silas did not argue, even though it was his only bed. He laid her gently on the quilt his mother had sewn, the last thing his mother's hands had ever made, and the woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. Tom left instructions for care and then had to go. Supplies waiting in Silver City, a schedule to keep. 3 brothers stood in the small bedroom, looking down at the stranger in their eldest brother's bed. That was when Caleb saw the bag. He picked it up, opened it, found the clothes, the book, and the letter. His letter, his handwriting. His words on paper that he had sent to a woman in Boston 6 weeks ago, promising her truth and respect, in a place where she would never need to pretend. The color drained from Caleb's face. Slowly, with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a rattlesnake, he drew the letter from the bag and held it out to Silas. "You need to read this." Silas took the letter, read it. His amber eyes widened. He looked at Caleb, looked at Clara, looked back at Caleb. "What have you done, Caleb?" The silence in that room could have crushed stone. Silas stood with the letter in one hand and his brother's betrayal in the other, and for a long moment the only sound was the feverish breathing of the woman on the bed, the woman who had traveled 4,000 miles to marry a Callaway. Just not the one she was looking at. But Silas Callaway was a man who understood priorities. And right now the priority was not his anger. It was the stranger burning with fever on his bed. "We will talk about this," he said to Caleb, and his voice carried the promise of a storm that had not yet broken. "But not now." He wrung out a cloth in cold water and laid it across Clara's forehead. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth, but his hands were gentle. He pulled a chair to the bedside and began his vigil. For 3 days, Silas Callaway sat beside that bed. He changed the cool cloths every hour using water from the creek that ran ice cold even in October to snowmelt from the peaks above. He dribbled small amounts of water between Clara's lips when she surfaced enough to swallow, careful not to give too much, too fast, the way he had learned from nursing sick cattle through bad winters. He talked to her softly, not knowing if she could hear, telling her about the ranch, about the weather, about the way the light hit the mountains in the morning. Anything to fill the silence. Anything to make the room feel less like a death watch and more like a place where someone might wake up. Josiah took over every chore on the ranch without being asked, fed the chickens, checked the cattle, repaired the section of fence that had come loose, brought in firewood, checked the traps on his morning patrol. That was Josiah's way. He did not offer words of comfort. He offered action. Silent, steady, unfailing action. Caleb cooked. Simple things. Porridge, broth, coffee that he carried up to Silas every few hours, setting the cup on the bedside table without speaking. It was his way of apologizing, not with words, but with the constant, quiet reminder that he was still here, still family, still trying. In the deep hours of the second night, Clara's eyes opened for the first time. Cornflower blue, glazed with fever, unable to focus. She tried to sit up, and Silas pressed her shoulder gently back down. You need to rest. You are safe here. Her eyes found his face in the dim glow of the oil lamp, fear and confusion swirling in the blue. Where? Her voice was barely a whisper, dry and cracked as old leather. My ranch, about 15 miles outside Elkhorn. A freight driver found you collapsed on the road and brought you here. You have a fever, but you are going to be all right. I promise. Something in his tone reached her. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. The quiet certainty of a man who did not make promises he could not keep. She relaxed back against the pillow, her eyes still searching his face. Thirsty. Silas poured fresh water from the pitcher and cradled her head with his free hand, bringing the cup to her lips. His hand was enormous, calloused and scarred across the knuckles, the hand of a man who had spent his entire adult life working with wood and iron and stone. But he held her head as though she were made of glass, and Clara, even through the fog of fever, registered the incongruity, this gentleness from these rough hands. She drank the entire cup. He would not let her have more. A little more soon, he promised. She nodded weakly, and her eyes drifted closed. The fever broke in the early hours of the third morning. Silas, who had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, woke to find Clara watching him in the pale gray light that filtered through the window before dawn. The frightening flush was gone from her face, replaced by a more natural pallor, and her eyes were clear and alert. Hello, she said softly, a hint of embarrassment in her expression. I am sorry for the trouble. Silas stood quickly, stiff from 3 nights in a wooden chair. No trouble at all. How are you feeling? Like someone who walked through a desert in October without enough water. A faint smile crossed her face. Which is exactly what I did. Foolish of me. And then came the moment that shifted everything between them. Clara asked him why he had cared for her. A complete stranger. She asked it directly without softening the question, and Silas heard in her voice something that surprised him. Not gratitude. Suspicion. That is what a decent man does, he said simply. Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying his face the way a person studies a contract before signing. Then she spoke, and for the first time Silas heard the sharp intelligence behind the delicate features and the fever-weakened voice. In Boston, I lived with people who called themselves decent. They gave me a home, clothes, and education. But every act of decency came with a price they collected when it suited them. She paused. Your decency, Mr. Calloway. What does it cost? He looked at her then, really looked, and understood that this was not the helpless girl he had assumed her to be. This was someone who had been hurt enough times to stop believing in kindness that came without strings. And that realization, strange as it was, made him respect her instantly. No cost, he said, except that when you are well, I will need you to explain the letter in your bag, the one addressed to my brother Caleb. On the 4th day, when Clara was strong enough to sit up and take solid food, Silas gathered his brothers around the kitchen table for a reckoning. Clara sat in the rocking chair by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching with those alert blue eyes. Caleb confessed everything. The mail-order bride advertisement. The letter written in his own name, but meant for his brother. The plan to find a wife for Silas because Silas would never find one for himself. He laid it all out plainly, without excessive apology, because he believed in what he had done. You fired a gun at the sky and prayed for companionship, Caleb said, looking directly at Silas. I heard you. Josiah heard you. The whole mountain heard you. I just helped God answer that prayer. Silas's anger was the dangerous kind. Not hot, cold, controlled. The kind that came from a man who was accustomed to bearing things alone and did not appreciate having his loneliness exposed for everyone to see. You decided for me, he said, without asking me. Josiah, who had been silent throughout, spoke a single sentence. Caleb was right, but next time ask first. And then Clara spoke. And what she said in that moment defined who she was for the rest of this story. She had been listening. She understood the situation. She had traveled 4,000 miles to meet one man and instead found three. The man she thought was her prospective husband turned out to be a matchmaker who had never asked permission. She had every right to weep, to rage, to walk out the door. Instead, Clara looked at each of the Calloway brothers in turn, Caleb with his apologetic grin, Josiah with his watchful green eyes, and Silas standing farthest away, his jaw set like granite, his amber eyes burning with something she could not yet name. In Boston, Clara said, her voice steady and calm in a way that none of them expected. Everything in my life was decided for me. What I wore, what I said, who I would marry. I traveled 4,000 miles to escape that. So I will not let anyone, including the three of you, make my decisions now. She looked directly at Silas. Mr. Calloway, do you want me to stay? Because if you do not, I will find another way. But I want to hear the answer from you, not from your brother. Caleb, standing by the stove, stopped breathing. Three enormous men, each well over 6 feet, each broad enough to fill a doorway, were being pinned in place by a woman barely 5'3", wrapped in a blanket, who had the audacity to look the biggest of them straight in the eye without flinching. Silas was caught completely off guard. He had prepared himself for tears, for fear, for anger. He was not prepared for composure, for intelligence, for a pair of cornflower blue eyes that demanded truth the way other eyes demanded pity. This woman, thin and hollow from fever, wrapped in a blanket like she was wearing a tent, possessed a will stronger than most men he had ever known. You can stay, Silas said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. At least until you decide what you want. You will have your own room. No one will touch you. No obligations beyond what you choose. This is where you belong, Caleb added, half hopeful, half apologetic. Clara nodded once. Then we have an arrangement. I stay, I cook, I manage the house. You teach me how to survive out here, and we see where it leads. The first morning, Clara was well enough to walk the property. Caleb gave her the tour. He showed her the cabin with its 5 rooms that smelled of pine resin and oak smoke, and candle wax, the kitchen with its cast iron stove that weighed 200 pounds and had taken all 3 brothers to haul up the mountain. He showed her the barn where 6 horses stood in their stalls, including Star, the wild Mustang mare, who nuzzled Caleb's hand like a house cat. He showed her the well that Josiah had dug by hand over 2 summers, 40 feet deep, the water so cold it made your teeth ache. The root cellar, the smokehouse where Josiah cured venison and elk and made sausages that would see them through winter. The small garden where the last potatoes and carrots of the season waited to be pulled before the first hard freeze. Clara took it all in with the wide eyes of someone who had never been more than 3 blocks from a cobblestone street. The smells were different here. Not sewage and coal smoke and horse manure baking on hot pavement, but pine and cold water and wood smoke and earth. The sounds were different too. No clatter of carriages, no shouting vendors, no church bells marking the quarter hours. Just wind, just the creek, just the distant lowing of cattle on the hillside and the occasional cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the ridge. She learned the rhythms of the ranch with surprising speed. Silas rose before anyone built the fire, ground the coffee beans in a stone mortar, and brewed it strong and black. The smell of that coffee, rough and smoky, mingling with the oak fire, would become the smell Clara would associate with the word home for the rest of her life. Caleb fed the chickens and milked the cow, a placid Jersey he had named Duchess. Josiah checked his trap lines and scouted the perimeter, reading the tracks and signs the way other men read newspapers. And by the time breakfast was done, the real work began. Fence mending, wood splitting, moving cattle, repairing the barn roof before winter came howling down from the peaks. Clara burned her first batch of pancakes. Caleb ate them anyway, declaring them character building. She learned to gather eggs from chickens that fought her for every one. She learned that a Montana morning could be 60 degrees at sunrise and below freezing by noon if the wind changed. She learned that the creek water was cold enough to numb your hands in seconds and clean enough to drink without boiling. And she learned slowly through watching and listening and asking questions that showed genuine curiosity rather than polite courtesy, the 1,000 small details of frontier life that meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Caleb taught her to ride, patient and cheerful, picking her up off the ground the third time she fell, without a trace of mockery in his warm amber eyes. Boston girl, he said, grinning, a horse is not a carriage. It has opinions of its own. Clara laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since arriving in Montana, and the sound carried across the yard to where Silas was repairing a fence post 50 yards away. He stopped, hammer raised. Something about that laugh, warm and unexpected and real, made the tightness in his chest ease by a fraction. Clara taught Caleb to read better in the evenings by the fire, using her mother's book as a textbook. Caleb could manage words, but he was slow sounding out syllables like a boy half his age. Clara was patient with him, the way good teachers are correcting without condescension. Josiah, uninvited, sat in the corner and listened quietly, filing away new words. Josiah taught Clara to read the woods, silently, practically. He showed her bear tracks in the mud by the creek, showed her the difference between a rattlesnake and a bull snake, taught her which sounds in the forest were normal and which meant danger. When she asked how he knew so much, he answered with the brevity that was his trademark. The mountain teaches, if you live long enough to learn. Then the first storm came. Josiah saw it first. He stepped onto the porch at dawn, looked at the sky, looked at the mountains, and saw the black clouds stacking up over the Bitterroot Peaks, the wind shifting northwest, the air heavy with the metallic smell that precedes snow. 2 words. Storm coming. Bad one, before noon. What followed was a master class in frontier teamwork. Silas and Josiah rode out to push the cattle into a natural stone windbreak on the lee side of the ridge. Caleb reinforced the barn, hammering loose boards and spreading extra straw for the horses. And Clara worked. She did not stand in the cabin and wait. She hauled firewood, smaller loads than the brothers, but she hauled it stack after stack from the woodpile to the indoor store. She chased chickens into the coop, getting pecked twice and cursing under her breath in language she had picked up in Boston drawing rooms. She had hot soup ready on the stove when they all came stumbling in, red-faced and half-frozen, stamping snow off their boots. They sat around the kitchen table, soup steaming, fire roaring, snow falling so thick through the windows that they could not see the barn 20 yards away. 4 people who had been strangers weeks ago huddled together against the storm, and for the first time since Clara's arrival, the cabin felt like something more than a house. It felt like a home. Josiah, who almost never spoke during meals, looked down at his bowl and said 2 words, "Good soup." From Josiah, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Clara smiled. Caleb hooted. Josiah complimented, cooking marked the calendar. And Silas, the most guarded of them all, allowed the faintest smile to cross his face hidden behind his coffee cup. "We will get through this," Silas said. A simple sentence aimed at the storm, but meaning something deeper. Something about all of them in this cabin together. Something about the future. She was learning to live on this mountain, but the mountain was not done teaching, and the next lesson would change everything between Clara and Silas forever. One clear morning, a week after the first snow, Clara was alone by the chicken coop when the black bear came. Not a grizzly, a black bear, young and curious, drawn by the smell of grain. But to a woman from Boston who had never seen anything more dangerous than a runaway carriage, it might as well have been a dragon. Clara froze. The bear stopped 20 feet away, sniffing the air. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, but her legs would not obey. She could not move, could not breathe. Then Silas was there. He came from the barn like a force of nature, assessing the situation in a single heartbeat, and stepped between Clara and the bear. He did not draw his gun. Instead, he spread his arms wide at his full height of 6'5" and roared. A sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, primal and enormous. A sound that shook the morning air and made the ground seem to vibrate. The bear, confronted with something that appeared even more dangerous than itself, wheeled around and crashed back into the tree line. Silas turned, and for the first time since Clara had known him, the concern on his face was completely unhidden. "Are you all right?" He put his hand on her shoulder. A big hand, calloused, warm. Clara, still trembling, looked up at him. The distance between their faces was only inches. Amber eyes met cornflower blue. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Something that could not be taken back. "I am fine," she said, "because of you." Silas pulled his hand away quickly as though her shoulder had burned him. "Do not go out alone, not yet." Then he turned and walked fast toward the barn, and Clara watched him go, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. After that day, small things began to change. Silas cut his hair neater, changed into a clean shirt before dinner. And every evening when he rode back from checking the cattle on the upper pasture, he brought wildflowers. Not a bouquet, just a few stems, whatever was blooming despite the cold. He placed them on the windowsill of Clara's room without saying a word. Caleb nearly commented on this new habit, but Josiah kicked him under the table before the words could form. Clara, for her part, began transforming the cabin from a place where men lived into a place where people lived. Curtains she sewed from fabric bought in Elkhorn, cushions for the hard wooden chairs, a cloth for the dinner table. And the thing that moved Silas most of all, she found the one remaining photograph of his parents, carefully framed it in a wooden border that Caleb carved, and hung it on the wall of the front room where everyone could see it. When Silas saw his parents on the wall, he stood very still for a long time. He did not speak. But that evening, the wildflowers on Clara's windowsill were larger than any day before. Their first real argument came over a visit to Elkhorn. Silas said she needed to stay with her aunt for propriety's sake. A single woman living with 3 unmarried men was not something polite society would approve of. "I do not need approval," Clara said, her voice going cold. "I spent my whole life living by other people's rules. I came here to live by mine. I am trying to protect you. I do not need protection from gossip. I need to not be a burden." Silence. Then Silas spoke softer. "You are not a burden, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. She looked at him, the anger draining away, replaced by something warmer and far more frightening. "Then do not decide for me. Ask me what I want. What do you want? To stay here until I decide otherwise." They drove to Elkhorn the next day. Clara's Aunt Maggie, a warm woman in her late 40s with her dead sister's eyes, recognized her niece instantly and pulled her into an embrace that was half laughter and half tears. Robert Thornton, Maggie's husband, shook Silas's hand with a look that said he was measuring the man against the responsibility of a niece. On the ride home, the wagon rolling through mountain country painted gold by the setting sun, Clara broke the comfortable silence. "Caleb told me about the night you fired your gun at the sky and prayed." Silas stiffened on the bench seat beside her. "The boy talks too much." "Are you ashamed of it?" "Yes." "Do not be. I prayed too. When I was walking through that desert, when I thought I was going to die, I asked God to let someone find me, to give me one more chance." A pause. "And then Tom came along, and then you were there." Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that their connection ran deeper than coincidence, deeper than a letter written by a well-meaning younger brother, deeper than a broken axle and a foolish decision to walk, something closer to destiny. Silas wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to tell her that he had been thinking the same thing every night for weeks, but he held back, afraid of moving too fast, afraid of frightening away the best thing that had ever happened to him. "Winter always ends," he said quietly, and Clara understood he was not talking about the weather. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the Callaway Ranch, Clara did not bolt her bedroom door. She was not entirely sure what it meant, but she thought perhaps he would understand. What she had not yet told Silas about Edward Harwell, about the threat he had made, about the man who might even now be searching for her across a continent, would soon catch up to her. And when the truth came out, everything between them would be tested to its breaking point. 3 weeks after Clara Winslow arrived at the Callaway Ranch, the porch had become their cathedral. Every evening after the work was done and the dishes were washed and the fire was banked low for the night, Silas and Clara would sit out there in the 2 chairs that faced west, watching the sun bleed out behind the Bitterroot Peaks, and they would talk. They talked about everything and nothing. Clara told him about her parents, about the bookshop in Boston, where her mother had taken her every Saturday, about the way her father smelled of ink and tobacco and the peppermint candies he kept in his vest pocket. Silas told her about his own parents, not the way they died, but the way they lived. His mother, who taught school before she married, who read to her 3 sons every night by lamplight, who could quiet a crying baby and solve a mathematics problem in the same breath. His father, stubborn as granite, a man from the Scottish Highlands, who loved the land the way some men love religion, completely and without apology. They talked about books Clara had read and Silas had not, about places Clara had been and Silas could not imagine, about the way light moved across the valley floor at different hours of the day and how the color of the mountains changed with the seasons. They talked about loneliness, though neither used the word. They circled around it the way you circle around a fire, getting close enough to feel the warmth, but never close enough to get burned. But there was one thing Clara had not told him. One piece of the story she kept locked behind her ribs, pressed tight against her heartbeat, where no one could reach it. She had told Silas about the engagement, told him it was arranged against her will, that she had broken it, that the family had been furious. But she had not told him about Edward's final words. She had not told him about the threat. And she had not told him that the man she was running from was the kind of man who kept his promises the way a snake keeps its venom. Always ready, always waiting. She had not told him because she was afraid. Not of Edward, not anymore. She was afraid that if Silas knew, if he understood the full weight of what she had brought to his doorstep, he would send her away. Not out of cruelty, but out of duty. He would decide that the safest thing for everyone was to remove the source of danger, and the source of danger was her. And Clara could not bear the thought of being sent away from this mountain. Not now, not when the wildflowers kept appearing on her windowsill every morning, placed there by hands that would never admit to placing them. Not when the porch conversations had become the thing she looked forward to most in every day. Not when the word home had started to mean something again for the first time in 3 years. She should have told him sooner. She would realize that later when the cost of her silence was measured in blood. It was Josiah who found the first sign. He was on his morning patrol, moving through the timber above the ranch with the silent precision that was as natural to him as breathing. His green eyes caught what most men would have missed entirely. Boot prints at the edge of the tree line, 50 yards from the fence. Not ranch boots, not the wide, flat soles of working men. These were narrow, heeled. The kind of boot a man bought in a city store and wore on cobblestone streets. And beside the prints, ground into the frozen earth, a cigarette stub. Expensive tobacco, Eastern brand. Josiah picked up the stub, held it to his nose, and memorized the smell. Then he followed the tracks backward through the trees, reading the story they told. One man, he had come from the south, following the main trail up the mountain, then left the trail about a mile from the ranch and moved through the forest to reach this observation point. He had stood here for some time, long enough to smoke 2 cigarettes, long enough to watch. Josiah reported to Silas with his usual economy of words. Someone watching us, city boots, Eastern tobacco, one man, maybe more. Silas's jaw tightened. From that moment, the rifle stayed within arm's reach. Clara was not to be out of sight when she was outdoors. The porch conversations continued, but now Silas sat facing the tree line. Then the letter came. Aunt Maggie rode up the mountain road on a cold morning with an envelope in her coat pocket and worry carved deep into her face. The letter had arrived at the Elkhorn post office, addressed to Clara Winslow. Maggie, who knew the postmaster and who had been receiving Clara's mail on her behalf, opened it. She read it once. Then she saddled her horse and rode 15 miles without stopping. The letter was brief. The handwriting was precise and elegant, the penmanship of a man who had been educated at the finest schools and who wielded language the way other men wielded weapons. Clara, did you think distance could hide you from me? I have sent men to find you, and they have found you. I am giving you 1 week to return to Boston voluntarily. If you do not, I will come personally. And believe me when I tell you that the ranchers you are living with will not enjoy the consequences. It was signed Edward Harwell. Silas read the letter, then read it again, then set it on the kitchen table and looked at Clara with amber eyes that burned with something she had never seen in them before. Not anger exactly, something deeper than anger. Something that came from the same place as the gunshot prayer he had fired into the sky the night before she arrived. You should have told me, he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that is more dangerous than any shout. Clara, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall, nodded. I know, I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would send me away, that I would become a burden instead of... She stopped, swallowed. Instead of what? Instead of someone worth keeping. The silence in that kitchen was absolute. The fire popped, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, and Silas Calloway, who had spent 5 years building walls around his heart that no one could breach, felt them crack. Not break, not yet, but crack the way ice cracks on a river in spring, thin lines spreading outward from a single point of pressure. You are not a burden, Clara. His voice dropped lower, rougher, as though the words cost him something physical. And no one will take you from here unless you want to go away from. That is a promise. A man keeps his word. And that was a promise he intended to keep with everything he had. Josiah took the letter, folded it once, and slid it into his shirt pocket without expression. I need a detailed description of this man. Everything you remember. Then he stood, took his rifle from the wall, and disappeared into the forest. When he returned, his report was delivered in the flat, precise tone of a man cataloging facts. 3 men camped in the timber, 2 miles south of the ranch. Good horses, new rifles, city boots. They were watching the trail, the only road in or out. Caleb, for the first time since Clara had known him, lost his smile. His face hardened into something older and more serious than his 22 years should have allowed. I brought her here, he said to Silas. This is my responsibility. Silas shook his head once. She is here. She belongs here. This is the responsibility of all of us. It was the first time he had said that Clara belonged. Not that she could stay, not that she was welcome, that she belonged. And Clara, hearing it, felt something break open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed for a very long time. Stronger together than apart. The ambush came 3 days later. Josiah left the ranch before dawn, the way he always did, riding the dun-gelding. He had trained himself, the horse that knew how to move through timber without snapping a branch. He carried his father's Winchester, the stock worn smooth, where generations of hands had gripped it. His intent was to track the watchers, to learn their patterns, to understand their movements well enough to predict their next step. He found their new observation post on a rocky outcrop above the main trail, the only road that connected the Callaway Ranch to the valley below. The boot prints were clearer here. 2 men this time, not one. Heeled boots, the soles barely scuffed, bought recently, never worn on rough ground before this week. Fresh cigarette butts beside a flat stone that had served as a seat. They had been here since before dawn. Josiah felt the danger before he understood it. It was a sensation that years of living in wild country had refined to an instinct as reliable as sight or hearing. The forest changed when a predator was near. The birds went silent. The wind carried a metallic edge that did not belong to the mountain. Something in the quality of the air itself shifted, became charged the way it does before lightning strikes. He started to turn his horse. 1 second too late. The first rifle shot came from the pine cover 30 yards to his left. It struck the gelding in the neck, and the animal went down hard, its legs folding beneath it. Josiah was thrown from the saddle, hitting the frozen ground with a force that drove the breath from his lungs. The second shot found him while he was still falling, punching through the muscle on the left side of his rib cage, grazing the 10th rib. The pain was immediate and enormous, a white-hot line of fire that traced from his side to his spine. But Josiah Callaway had been surviving on this mountain since he was 20 years old. Pain was familiar. Panic was not an option. His body responded before his mind caught up, rolling behind the trunk of a ponderosa pine 3 feet wide, dragging the Winchester with him, his left arm pressed against the wound to slow the bleeding. His hands were shaking, but his grip on the rifle was steady. Instinct was stronger than agony. He fired twice, not to kill, to suppress, to buy time. The shots crashed through the branches where the muzzle flashes had appeared, and the sharp crack of splitting wood told him he was close enough to make the attackers think twice. They retreated. Josiah heard the sound of boots crashing through undergrowth, moving away, heading south. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it around his midsection, pulling it tight enough to make his vision gray at the edges. The bleeding slowed but did not stop. He began crawling toward the ranch, dragging himself across the carpet of pine needles and frozen leaves, leaving a trail of dark red on the earth behind him. Half a mile. That was all he needed, half a mile. He made it about 400 yards before his body quit. He rolled onto his back on a thin crust of early snow and stared up at the sky through the pine branches, his rifle still clutched in his right hand, because a Callaway did not let go of his weapon and his green eyes began to close. Silas heard the gunshots from the ranch. 2 distant reports, then 2 more, the sound rolling across the valley like far-off thunder. He was saddled and riding within 30 seconds. He found Josiah lying in the snow, eyes shut, face the color of ash blood soaking through the makeshift bandage and spreading across the white ground in a pattern that looked like spilled paint. Silas dropped from his horse and knelt beside his brother. His fingers found the pulse point at Josiah's neck. There, weak and too fast, but there. Still beating, still alive. He got his arms under Josiah's back end and lifted him. 190 pounds of dead weight, but the adrenaline made it feel like nothing, like lifting a child. He draped Josiah across the saddle, one hand holding his brother in place, the other gripping the reins, and braked the horse into a gallop toward home. Caleb heard the hoofbeats and came running from the barn with a rifle in each hand. Clara stood in the doorway. She watched Silas thunder into the yard, Josiah draped across the horse, like a sack of grain blood running in a steady stream down the horse's white belly and dripping into the dust. And she saw Silas's face. The face that was always composed, always controlled, always the granite mask of a man who carried the world on his shoulders without complaint. That face was white, bloodless. His amber eyes, usually so sharp and steady, were wild with a terror she had never seen in them before, and hope she would never see again. "Josiah," Silas said. One word. His voice cracked on it like wood splitting. Clara looked at Josiah, the man who left warm water outside her door every morning before she woke. The man who killed rattlesnakes on the path she walked without telling her. The man who smiled so rarely that when he did, it felt like watching the sun come out after a week of rain. He was unconscious, he was bleeding, and he needed her right now more than he had ever needed anyone. She made her choice in a heartbeat. "Silas, boil water. 3 pots, now." Her voice came out calm, clear, and commanding in a way that surprised even herself. "Caleb, every clean cloth in this house. Tear them into strips and bring the whiskey. Not for drinking." Silas, who was accustomed to giving orders, not taking them, looked at Clara, 5'3", hands already red with Josiah's blood from helping lift him onto the bed, and in her cornflower blue eyes a steadiness that he recognized because it was the same steadiness he saw in the mirror on his worst days. The steadiness of someone who knew what needed to be done and would not stop until it was done. He obeyed. Not because he was weak, because she was right. Because in this moment, knowledge mattered more than muscle. Because the woman from Boston, who could not saddle a horse 6 weeks ago, was now the only person on this mountain who knew how to save his brother's life. Clara examined the wound with practiced fingers, pressing gently but thoroughly, the way she had read about in the medical texts she had studied during those long, lonely evenings in the Harwell Library. Not because she had planned on becoming a doctor, because on the nights when Edward was at his parties and she was alone in that vast empty house, the medical books were the only ones in the library that no one else had read, and so she read them, cover to cover, anatomy, surgical technique, wound care, knowledge that had been theoretical until this exact moment. The bullet had passed through cleanly. Entry wound on the left side, exit wound in the back. No lodged projectile. She listened to his breathing. No rasping, no bubbling, no whistling. The lung was intact. The blood was dark, not bright, flowing steadily, but not spurting. Muscle wound, not arterial. "He will live," Clara said, and Silas, standing in the doorway holding a pot of boiling water, nearly dropped it from the force of his relief. "If we prevent infection." For 3 days, Clara nursed Josiah back from the edge. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and then with whiskey, and when the liquor hit the raw flesh, Josiah, half-conscious, snarled with pain and then managed a protest so weak it was almost comical. "That was good whiskey," Clara, without missing a beat, replied, "and now it is saving your life, so hold still and be quiet." Caleb, standing in the doorway, bit his fist to keep from laughing, despite the gravity of the situation. She changed the bandages 3 times a day, inspecting the wound each time for the red streaks and foul smell that would mean infection. She forced water down his throat every hour, spooning it past his lips the way you feed a sick child. She kept the fire high and the room warm and the blankets clean. On the second night the fever came. Josiah burned with it, his skin hot enough to feel through the blankets, his green eyes rolling behind closed lids, his hands clutching at the sheets. Clara sat beside him through the darkest hours, replacing the cool cloths on his forehead, watching for the subtle signs that would tell her whether the fever was breaking or building. And in the deep silence of 3 in the morning, when the fire had burned low and the wind was howling outside like something alive and hungry, Clara sang. Softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung in Boston about the moon and the sea and a house that was always waiting with a light in the window. Josiah's hand found hers in the darkness. His grip was weak but desperate, the grip of a man clinging to something real in a world that had gone shapeless and terrifying. He whispered a single word, "Mother." Clara's tears came then, silent and unstoppable, sliding down her cheeks and dripping onto the quilt. But her voice did not waver. "Not your mother, but I am here, and I am not going anywhere." Something in her voice reached him even through the fever. His face softened, his breathing steadied. His grip on her hand relaxed, though he did not let go. Silas stood outside the bedroom door for most of those 3 days. He watched Clara work, watched her small hands move with gentle precision as she changed the bandages, watched her soft voice turn firm, brooking no argument when she told Josiah to drink to rest, to stop trying to sit up. Watched her pour herself into the care of his brother with a selflessness that left no room for pretense or performance. This was real. This was who she was. And the love that rose in Silas Calloway's chest during those 3 days was so powerful that it frightened him. Because he had been telling himself for weeks that what he felt was gratitude or admiration or simple affection. But watching Clara save his brother's life with knowledge from books and iron from her own soul, he could no longer pretend. This was love, the kind of love that rearranges everything inside you. The kind that makes you realize the life you were living before was only half a life. She has earned every part of this life, Silas said to Caleb one evening, not knowing that Clara, inside the room with the door cracked open, could hear every word. On the third morning, the fever broke. Josiah's eyes opened clear and green and sharp as cut glass. The first thing he saw was Clara asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting against the mattress, her hand still holding his. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her honey blonde hair unpinned and tangled. But Josiah, in that first waking moment, thought she looked like the most tired angel he had ever seen. He did not wake her. He lay still, looking at the ceiling, feeling her hand in his warm and small and real. And for the first time in 5 years, the word alone did not apply to him. When Clara woke and saw him watching her, she pulled her hand back, flustered. Josiah, who spoke less than any man in Montana Territory, said 2 words that carried more weight than most men's speeches. "Thank you." Then, because the tracker in him never slept even when the rest of him nearly died, he added, 2 men, rifles, city boots. That evening, the 4 of them gathered in the kitchen. Caleb had ridden to Elkhorn to alert Sheriff Mercer and returned with news that sat in the room like a loaded gun. Edward Harwell had arrived in Montana. He was staying at the hotel in Elkhorn. He had 2 men with him matching the description of the ambushers and a lawyer carrying a briefcase full of papers intended to establish a legal claim on Clara as property of the Harwell family. Clara heard this and went very still. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. "I should leave. If I go, he will leave you alone. All of this Josiah being shot, the threats, all of it is because of me." 3 voices answered at once. 3 brothers who agreed on almost nothing except this, Silas. "You are not going anywhere." Josiah from the bed, his voice thin but certain, "You stay." Caleb, "I did not bring you here to let you go." And then Silas said what he had been holding inside for weeks. He stood in front of Clara, the difference in their heights, making him look down at her the way a mountain looks down at the valley below it. And he spoke with a voice that trembled with the effort of saying words he had never said to any living soul. "Clara, I prayed for companionship. I prayed for someone to share this life with. And then you appeared exactly like an answer straight from heaven. I tried to keep my distance, tried not to hope, tried to protect myself from being hurt, but I cannot do it anymore." The fire crackled, the wind pushed against the walls, the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. "I love you, Clara, in a way I did not think I was still capable of loving, and I will not let anyone take you from here, not if you want to stay." Clara stepped forward. She placed her small hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel it hammering beneath her palm fast and hard, the heart of a man who was terrified not of bears or blizzards or gunmen, but of this, of being vulnerable, of being seen. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to stay with you. I have loved you since the night you told me about your mother by the fire, since the morning I found wildflowers on my windowsill and knew you had put them there and would never admit it. I want to build this life with you, Silas. Please let me stay." Silas bent down, closing the distance between them, and pressed his lips to her forehead. Gentle, reverent, full of a promise that did not need words because it was written in every line of his body, in every day he had woken before dawn, to build this place in every silent prayer he had sent into the Montana sky. "Stay," he whispered. "Forever. I did not expect you, but I am not letting you go." The next day, Silas and Clara rode down to Elkhorn together. They went to the sheriff's office first, where Daniel Mercer, a decent man stretched thin by too much territory, and too few deputies listened to their account and examined the threatening letter. He was sympathetic but honest. "I need more than a letter and a suspicion to arrest a man from Boston with a lawyer in his pocket. Bring me evidence, witnesses, something I can take before a judge." When they stepped out of the sheriff's office and onto the wooden sidewalk, Edward Harwell was waiting. He stood on the opposite side of the street, immaculate in a black vest and a wool overcoat that would have been appropriate in a Boston drawing room and looked absurd in the dusty frontier town of Elkhorn. Tall, with black hair slicked back from a high forehead, gray eyes that held the temperature of a January creek. Beside him stood a man in a dark suit carrying a leather case, the lawyer. Edward crossed the street with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He stopped 10 feet from Clara and smiled. Not a warm smile. The kind of smile a cat gives a mouse when it knows the mouse has nowhere left to run. "Clara, you look different. The West suits you." His gray eyes moved to Silas, traveling upward because Silas was considerably taller. Something flickered behind Edward's composed expression. Not fear exactly, an involuntary reassessment. "And this must be the mail-order husband, or one of several from what I hear." Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and Edward. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, 6'5", broad as a barn door, his amber eyes locked onto Edward's gray ones with the fixed intensity of a man who has already decided how this will end. "I know who you are, Harwell. And if you are wise, you will be on the next stage out of Montana and never come back." Edward, to his credit or his foolishness, held his ground. "Threats from a mountain rancher, I am trembling." He looked past Silas to Clara. "You have 1 week, Clara, 1 week to come back voluntarily. After that, I will use every means available to me, legal, financial, and otherwise." Silas took one more step forward. Edward retreated half a step before he could stop himself, an involuntary flinch in the face of pure physical authority. Then he recovered, straightened his coat, gave a curt nod, and walked away. The lawyer followed, glancing back once with the calculating expression of a man who was already drafting motions. Clara watched Edward go and realized something strange. Her hands were not shaking. Her heart was not pounding. The man who had terrorized her in Boston, who had loomed over her life like a dark cloud for 3 years, looked small here. Small against the mountains. Small next to Silas. Small in a world where strength was measured not in money or social standing, but in what a person could build with their own 2 hands. On the ride home, Silas stopped the wagon at a clearing overlooking the valley. The sunset was doing what Montana sunsets do, painting the entire world in shades of amber and rose and deep purple, the snow on the peaks catching the last light like fire. He stared straight ahead when he spoke, not at Clara, because if he looked at her, he would lose his nerve. "Clara, I want to marry you, not because of the letter, not because of the situation, not because of Edward Harwell and his threats, because I love you." He paused, searching for the right words, and when they came, they were plain and unadorned and completely Silas. "I do not have a diamond ring. I do not have a fine house in the city. I have a ranch on a mountain, 3 bedrooms, 40 head of cattle, and two loud brothers. But I have a promise. I will never try to make you someone you are not. I will never treat you like something to be owned, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." A long silence. Mountain wind. The horse stamping one hoof on the frozen dirt. Then Silas finally turned to look at Clara and found her smiling through tears, the widest smile he had ever seen on her face. "You are the worst man in the world at proposals," she said. "You just listed everything you do not have. Because I want you to know exactly what you are getting, so you will not be deceived." Silas Calloway. Clara reached up and placed her hand against his cheek, her small palm warm against the rough stubble of his jaw. Yes, I will marry you. With the ranch and the 40 cows and the 3 bedrooms and the 2 loud brothers. Tomorrow, if we can arrange it." Silas smiled, a real smile. Rare and slow and transforming. Like sunlight breaking through a week of clouds, turning his stern face into something warm enough to stop her breath. He leaned down the distance between them, requiring him to bend considerably, and for the first time he kissed her mouth. Brief and gentle tasting of coffee and cold mountain air, the roughness of his beard against the softness of her skin. Then he pulled back, his amber eyes bright. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will speak to the preacher." But tomorrow brought something else entirely. Clara rode alone to visit Aunt Maggie the following morning. The Thornton Ranch was closer to Elkhorn than to the Calloway place, and the road between them was well-traveled and considered safe. Silas had hesitated to let her go without him, but the Thornton Ranch was practically in town, and Robert Thornton was a capable man with a loaded rifle above his door. Clara would be fine. She would be safe. She never arrived. Two riders intercepted her on the trail 3 miles south of the ranch. They came out of the tree line, fast flanking her horse before she could turn, and one of them grabbed her reins while the other pulled alongside and took her arm. They were not rough. They did not strike her or threaten her with weapons. But they were firm and they were fast, and within minutes, Clara was riding a horse she did not control, heading east toward a cabin she had never seen, and the mountain she had come to love was shrinking behind her. When Maggie Thornton realized Clara had not arrived, she did not wait. She saddled her own horse and rode straight up the mountain to the Calloway Ranch, 15 miles of hard trail, and she did it in under 2 hours because Margaret Thornton was a frontier woman who understood that speed was the difference between a problem and a tragedy. She found Silas in the yard splitting wood. The axe was still raised above his head when he saw her face. "Clara never came," Maggie said. She did not need to say anything else. The axe hit the ground. Silas stood motionless for 3 seconds. To Josiah, watching from the window, those 3 seconds were the most frightening thing he had witnessed in a life that had included watching his parents die of fever 2 weeks apart. Because in those 3 seconds, the light in Silas Calloway's amber eyes went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Went out the way a lamp goes out when you turn the wick all the way down. And what replaced it was something that Josiah recognized from the eyes of wounded animals. The blank, desperate focus of a creature that has nothing left to lose. Then Silas moved. Josiah was already standing, gripping the bedpost for support, his wound pulling with every breath, but his green eyes blazing. Caleb was checking the loads in 2 revolvers, his face set like stone, every trace of boyishness gone. "We ride," Silas said. Josiah insisted on going. Silas compromised. "You lead from horseback. Do not dismount. Do not run. You point. Caleb and I act." Josiah accepted. From a man who had never accepted limitations from anyone, that was its own kind of sacrifice. 3 brothers rode into the winter forest. Josiah, despite the pain that whitened his knuckles on the reins, tracked the way he always tracked, reading hoof prints in the soft snow, distinguishing Clara's horse-lighter shod with mountain shoes from the horses of her captors, heavier, wearing New City farrier work. He followed the trail with the patience and precision that made him the best tracker in the Bitterroot Valley, and within 3 hours he had found the cabin. It sat in a clearing 2 miles off the main trail, a prospector's shack long since abandoned. Smoke from the chimney. 2 horses tied outside. Lamplight flickering through the single window. Inside that cabin, Clara Winslow sat on a wooden crate across from the man who believed he owned her. Edward Harwell had brought a china teacup from Boston. He was drinking tea from it now. His legs crossed, his posture relaxed, the very picture of civilized calm in a room that smelled of mildew and rotting wood. It was perhaps the most revealing detail of his character. Even in the wilderness, even in a decaying cabin in the middle of nowhere, he needed to recreate the trappings of control, the familiar rituals, the fine things, the illusion that he was still in charge of his world. "Clara," he said, his voice sweet in a way that made her skin crawl, "I do not want to hurt you. I never wanted that. I simply want you to come home, to come back where you belong." Clara's hands were bound in front of her loosely with rope that the hired men had tied with a certain reluctant carefulness that suggested they had rules about how they treated women. She looked at Edward across the dim, smoky room, and she waited for the fear to come. The old fear. The Boston fear. The kind that had kept her silent at dinner parties while he talked over her, that had made her agree to an engagement she did not want, that had made her feel small and powerless and worth nothing more than the decorative function she served. The fear did not come. In its place was something new, something that had been growing inside her since the morning she woke up in Silas Calloway's bed, with a stranger's hand holding a cup of water to her lips and a deep voice promising she would be all right. Something that had hardened through weeks of splitting firewood and chasing chickens and riding horses and nursing gunshot wounds and standing in the doorway of a cabin on a mountain and knowing in her bones that this was where she was supposed to be. She was not afraid of Edward Harwell anymore. And that more than anything else told her exactly how far she had come. "Do you know what makes you different from Silas Calloway?" Clara asked. Her voice was calm, remarkably calm. Edward set his teacup on the overturned barrel that served as a table. His gray eyes narrowed. "Silas is stronger than you, taller, braver, more capable in every way that matters out here. But that is not the biggest difference." She paused, held his gaze. "When Silas looks at me, he sees a person. When you look at me, you see a thing. I spent too many years being a thing that belonged to someone else. That is over now." Edward rose from his chair, his face flushed red. Not from shame, from the outraged disbelief that a former governess, a girl with nothing, would dare speak to him this way. "You will regret this." "I already have regrets," Clara said, her voice gaining an edge that would have been unthinkable 6 weeks ago. "I regret being silent for so long. I regret letting your family treat me like property and accepting it because I thought I had no choice. But I do have a choice. I have made it, and I choose Silas. I choose this mountain. I choose the life I am building with my own hands, not the one you want to shove me into." Edward stepped toward her. His composure was cracking the polished Boston veneer splitting apart to reveal something ugly, underneath something that had always been there, but had been hidden behind the manners and the money and the careful smile. And that was when the cabin door exploded inward. Silas Calloway filled the door frame the way a storm fills a valley, shoulders nearly touching both sides of the frame, sweat and snow on his face, his breath coming in white clouds in the cold air, his father's shotgun cradled in arms thick as pine boughs, and on his face a calm so absolute and so controlled that it was more terrifying than any rage could ever be. This was not a man who had lost his temper. This was a man in perfect command of himself, and that command was directed entirely at Edward Harwell. Edward lurched backward, his hand reaching for the pistol on the table. The 2 hired guns stationed outside had already made their calculation. 3 enormous men, armed furious, positioned with tactical precision. One at the back door, one on the ridge with a rifle. And this one, this mountain of a man standing in the front entrance with a shotgun and eyes like molten gold. The hired men set their weapons on the ground and raised their hands. "We were paid to find the girl," one of them said, "not to die for her." Silas crossed the room in 2 strides and took the pistol from Edward's hand, the way a parent takes a dangerous toy from a child, without effort, without hurry. The difference in their physical strength was so vast that it did not even qualify as a contest. "You sent men to shoot my brother," Silas said. Each word landed like a hammer on an anvil. "You kidnapped the woman I love." Edward pressed against the cabin wall, looked up into amber eyes that held no mercy and no uncertainty, and for the first time in his privileged and pampered life understood what it meant to be powerless. Truly powerless. Not the inconvenience of a business setback or a social embarrassment. The bone-deep body freezing powerlessness of standing in front of a man who could end you with his bare hands and knowing that the only reason he has not is a choice he is making second by second to hold himself back. Clara stood. She placed her bound hands against Silas's arm, a small touch on a large arm. But the weight of it was greater than any physical force. "Do not," she said softly, "do not become what he wants you to be. Let the law handle this." Silas looked at Clara. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but faith. Faith that he was more than his anger, more than his strength. That he was the man she had chosen not because he could break things, but because he could choose not to. And that faith, small and fierce and unshakable, pulled him back from the edge. Actions, not words. And his action was mercy. "I'm letting you go," Silas said to Edward, "because she asked me to. But if I see your face in Montana again, God himself will not be able to help you." He released Edward, who slid down the wall to the cabin floor, coughing and gasping. Caleb appeared at the back door with Sheriff Mercer, who had been alerted by Maggie Thornton and was already on his way. Edward Harwell was placed under arrest for kidnapping and conspiracy to commit assault. And then Silas turned to Clara. He wrapped his arms around her and held her against his chest, held her the way a man holds something he almost lost, held her with a desperate, trembling strength that belied every stoic mask he had ever worn. His face pressed into her hair, and he whispered the same words over and over so quietly that only she could hear them. "You are here. You are here. You are here." Josiah, watching from the hillside through the scope of his rifle, lowered the weapon and allowed himself to breathe for the first time in hours. Caleb, standing beside the sheriff, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and pretended it was the wind. "I am not going anywhere," Clara said, her face pressed against his chest, listening to the heartbeat that had become the most important sound in her world. "I am home." "You are home now," Silas said, and his voice broke on the word home, broke wide open, and everything he had held inside for 5 years of solitude and grief and stubborn self-reliance came pouring through the crack. But what happened next did not just save Clara. It proved that love, when it is real, can change even the hardest of men. The morning after the rescue, Clara woke in the cabin on the mountain that she had come to think of as hers. Not a borrowed place, not a temporary shelter. Hers. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house, and she heard something that made her smile before her eyes were fully open. The clink of a tin coffee pot on a cast-iron stove. The low creak of a floorboard under a heavy boot. The smell of coffee, rough and smoky, mixed with oak fire drifting through the gap under the bedroom door. Silas was up before her. He was always up before her. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, that thought did not make her feel like a guest. It made her feel like she was home. She found him sitting at the kitchen table, his big hands wrapped around a cup, staring out the window at the first gray light of dawn, touching the snow on the Bitterroot Peaks. When she came through the doorway, he turned and Clara saw something on his face that she had never seen before. Not the careful control, not the guarded distance, not the stern composure he wore like armor. What she saw was peace. The deep, settled peace of a man who had spent the night not watching the ceiling in the dark, not replaying nightmares, not counting the hours until morning, but sleeping, actually sleeping, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Coffee is ready," he said. A pause. The fire popped softly in the stove. "I sat here for 10 minutes trying to think of something profound to say on the first morning after all of that. But all I came up with is, coffee is ready." Clara laughed. Warm and real, the sound filling the small kitchen, the way sunlight fills a room when you open the curtains. Silas smiled in return, and the smile transformed his face in the way it always did when it was genuine, turning the granite into something human and warm and worth loving. Josiah appeared 10 minutes later, moving slowly, his wound still pulling with every step, but his green eyes clear. He poured himself coffee without speaking, gave Clara a single nod that was his version of a warm embrace, and settled into his chair by the window. Caleb arrived last, trailing cold air from the barn, carrying a fistful of wildflowers that had somehow survived the frost. "Flowers for the bride," he announced, holding them up with a grin. "A bit dead from the cold, but the spirit is willing." Clara took the frozen flowers and set them in a cup of water on the table, and the four of them sat together in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and nobody said much because nothing much needed to be said. The storm had passed, they were all still here, and that was enough. The wedding took place on a cold but clear day in late December of 1878 in the small white church in Elkhorn. The church was not much to look at, wooden pews that could hold maybe 40 people. A pot-bellied stove in the corner that the Reverend stoked with pine logs an hour before the service to take the worst of the chill off the air. Windows of plain glass, not stained, through which the winter light came in clean and white and honest. Aunt Maggie and Robert Thornton stood as witnesses. Robert, who had not said 10 words to Silas in their entire acquaintance, shook his hand before the ceremony and said, "You take care of that girl." It was not a request. It was a condition. Silas met his eyes and nodded once. Josiah stood beside Silas at the altar, his face showing an emotion so rare that the handful of townspeople in attendance did not quite know what to make of it. He was smiling. Not the faint, barely there flicker that passed for a smile in Josiah's daily life. A real smile. Full and unguarded, the kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. Caleb held the wedding ring. A simple gold band that the three brothers had pooled their money to buy from the jeweler in Elkhorn, a man who normally dealt in silver mining supplies and had to send to Helena for a proper ring. Caleb cried through the entire ceremony. The man who laughed more than anyone in Montana Territory could not stop the tears from rolling down his face as he watched his eldest brother, man he had written a secret letter to, stand before God and make promises to the woman that letter had brought. Clara wore a white dress that Maggie had helped her sew. Simple, practical, beautiful in the way that honest things are beautiful without ornament or pretension. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up with a sprig of dried wildflower that Caleb had pressed between the pages of a book weeks ago, saving it for this day without telling anyone. Silas wore his only suit, He had bought it 5 years ago for his parents' funeral and had not expected to need it again for anything joyful. The fabric was slightly too tight across the shoulders now, because 5 years of ranch work had made him broader, but Clara thought he looked magnificent. Not because of the suit, because of his eyes. Those amber eyes which she had first seen through the fog of fever, which had watched over her through 3 days of sickness, which had burned with fury when Edward threatened her and softened with tenderness when he placed wildflowers on her windowsill. Those eyes looking at her now across the small church held everything he had never been able to say in words. When Silas slid the gold band onto Clara's finger and kissed her as his wife, something fundamental shifted inside him. A piece he had not known was missing, clicked into place. 5 years of carrying everything alone, 5 years of silence in work and endurance, and now finally someone to share it all with. The wedding breakfast was held at the Thornton Ranch, where Maggie had prepared a spread of food that seemed impossible for one woman to have cooked, but which she insisted was nothing special. Neighbors came, ranch families from the surrounding valleys, some of whom had ridden 2 hours to be there. Mrs. Patterson from the general store brought a cake she had baked herself. Old Henderson, the rancher, who would later lose $20 to Clara's negotiating skills, brought a jug of apple brandy and a handshake that nearly broke Silas's fingers. And then Caleb brought out the violin. It had been their father's, a battered instrument with a crack along the neck that their father had repaired with glue and a strip of rawhide, and it had not been played since the night before he died. Caleb drew the bow across the strings, and the first notes of a Scottish folk song filled the room, a melody their father had sung to their mother on winter evenings when the world outside was frozen and the world inside was warm. Silas looked at Clara, Clara looked at Silas, and they danced. Badly. Silas had never danced in his life, and his attempt involved a great deal of counting under his breath and stepping on toes and holding Clara as though she were something that might shatter if he gripped too hard. But he tried. He tried because she was smiling, and her smile was worth any amount of awkwardness. That was when Josiah laughed. It came from the corner of the room where he was sitting with a cup of cider watching the spectacle of his enormous brother attempting to waltz. It was not a chuckle or a snort or a brief exhalation of amusement. It was a laugh, a full, deep, unrestrained sound that rose from somewhere inside Josiah Calloway that had been sealed shut for 5 years. The sound of it stopped the room. Caleb's bow froze on the strings. Silas and Clara stopped mid-step. Every head turned toward the quietest man in Montana, who was laughing as though he had just remembered how. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all understood what that sound meant. Josiah Calloway, who had watched his parents die of fever 2 weeks apart, who carried nightmares like other men carried pocket watches, who had spoken fewer words in 5 years than most people spoke in a week, was laughing, and the healing had begun. Silas carried Clara over the threshold of the cabin that was now theirs. Their cabin, their home, their life. "Welcome home," he said, setting her down gently in the front room. Clara looked around at the simple space, the stone fireplace Silas had built, the quilt his mother had sewn, the photograph of his parents that she had framed and hung on the wall, the windowsill where wildflowers had appeared every morning like clockwork, and the rocking chair where a lonely man had once sat staring into the fire, wondering if this was all there would ever be. "I am home," she said, finally completely home. The bedroom door closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything between them had changed. The shyness replaced by familiarity, the distance replaced by closeness, and two lonely hearts had found a rhythm they would keep for the rest of their lives. Built this with our own hands. Spring came to the Bitterroots, the way it always comes, slowly, grudgingly, the snow retreating inch by inch up the mountainsides, revealing the dark earth beneath like a secret being told. The creeks swelled with meltwater, running fast and cold and loud over their stony beds. The first green appeared in patches on the south-facing slopes and then spread like a tide across the meadows until the whole valley was alive with new grass. Wildflowers followed, yellow arrowleaf, purple lupine, red Indian paintbrush. Silas brought armfuls of them home, every evening bundles so large that Clara finally had to tell him she had run out of things to put them in. He stopped for one day, then he had Caleb carve 2 new vases from pine. Spring also brought news from the courthouse. Edward Harwell was convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy to assault. The trial was brief. Sheriff Mercer presented the testimony of the two hired gunmen who had turned on their employer with the pragmatic efficiency of men who understood that loyalty to a Boston businessman was not worth a prison sentence in Montana territory. Clara testified with the steady voice and clear eyes that had become her defining quality. And Josiah, who hated crowds the way some people hate snakes, stood before the jury, lifted his shirt to show the scar on his ribs, and spoke exactly 4 sentences. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. When Edward was led away in chains, he looked back at Clara one last time. And Clara, standing beside Silas with her hand in his, looked back without hatred and without fear. Only sadness. Sadness for a man who had been given every advantage the world could offer and had never learned the one thing that mattered: how to love someone without trying to own them. "I hope he finds peace," Clara said on the ride home. "I truly do." Silas looked at her, and the kindness in her words, the ability to feel compassion for the man who had tried to destroy her, made him love her again. Every day he found a new reason. She has earned every part of this life. Clara proposed expanding the herd that spring, buying cattle from a rancher named Henderson, who was looking to downsize. Silas was impressed by how quickly she had grasped the economics of ranching. She read the livestock prices posted at the general store in Elkhorn every time they went to town. She kept a small notebook of expenses and income, a habit from her days as a governess, managing the Harwell household accounts. The irony was not lost on either of them. The skills the Harwell family had taught her were now building the Callaway legacy. They bought the cattle together, and Clara negotiated the final price with a quiet competence that left old Henderson shaking his head in admiration. "Son," he said to Silas, "you married better than I thought. She just took $20 off me, and I still want to thank her for it." On the ride home, driving the new cattle up the mountain trail, Clara rode beside Silas on horseback. She rode well now, confident, her back straight, her hands steady on the reins. Caleb had taught her well. Silas watched her against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks and blue Montana sky and thought about the man he had been 1 year ago. Alone, desperate, firing a gun at the sky and begging God for an answer. And now he had this woman, a bigger herd, 2 healthy brothers, and the most beautiful spring he had ever seen. God had not just answered his prayer, he had answered it tenfold. By summer, Clara had started teaching. She noticed that the children of neighboring ranching families could barely read, if they could read at all. The nearest school was in Elkhorn, 15 miles of mountain road away, too far for young children to travel daily. She proposed holding classes twice a week in the Callaway front room. Silas hesitated at first. The front room was his front room, and he was accustomed to its silence. But when he saw the light in Clara's eyes as she talked about teaching, the same light he had fallen in love with the night she read by the fireplace, he could not refuse her anything. Parents paid in kind: venison, butter, eggs, and the most valuable currency of all on a frontier ranch, labor. Neighbors helped repair fences, dig a new well, build a storage shed. The network of community that the Callaway Ranch had always lacked began to form, woven together by a woman from Boston who had arrived with nothing but a small bag and had become the thread that connected them all. In the autumn of 1879, almost exactly 1 year after Silas had fired his gun at the sky and prayed for companionship, Clara gave birth to their first child, a boy. Maggie had come to stay a week earlier. Silas paced the front room like a caged animal, his boot heels wearing a track in the floorboards. Josiah sat in his corner, cleaning his rifle, which was what Josiah did when he was worried. Caleb sat on the porch, wringing his hat in his hands until the brim was shapeless. The cry of a newborn cut through the evening air like a blade of pure light. Silas was through the bedroom door before the sound had faded. Clara lay propped against the pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding a bundle so small it seemed impossible that it could contain an entire human being. "Come meet your son," she said. Silas looked down at the tiny face, the eyes trying to focus, the fingers so small they could barely wrap around one of his. And something inside him, something that had been clenched tight since the day he dug his parents' graves in frozen ground, finally let go. They named him Samuel, after Silas's father's middle name. "I prayed for companionship," Silas said that night, sitting on the edge of the bed, his infant son asleep in the crook of one massive arm, his wife leaning against his shoulder. "God gave me a family." Charlotte arrived in 1883, blue-eyed and blonde, her mother's image, with a love of books that declared itself before she could properly walk. Samuel at 4 was fascinated by his baby sister and showed a gentleness around her that reminded Clara of the way Silas handled newborn calves. In 1885, Caleb married Emily, the red-haired daughter of the Elkhorn blacksmith, a woman whose laughter could be heard from 100 yards away and whose energy matched Caleb's own the way a spark matches kindling. He cried through the entire ceremony, just as he had at Silas's wedding, and the congregation at the Little Elkhorn Church, now familiar with Callaway wedding traditions, passed handkerchiefs down the pews without being asked. Emily moved on to the mountain, and Caleb built a house beside the main cabin, and for the first time there were 2 lit windows on the Bitterroot slope at night, instead of 1, and the isolation that had once pressed down on Silas like a physical weight lifted by half. Clara and Emily became immediate friends. The only 2 women on the mountaintop, they cooked together, sewed together, and endured the Callaway men together with a patience that bordered on the heroic. Emily brought something to Clara's life that Clara had not known she needed: the freedom to laugh without reason to be imperfect, without apology to sit on the porch and say nothing meaningful and feel perfectly content. Clara, in return, gave Emily books to read through the long winter's sharp conversation that challenged and delighted, and advice on managing Caleb when his ideas outran his judgment, which happened frequently. Then the drought came. The summer of 1886 brought no rain. The creeks that fed the ranch slowed to trickles, and the meadow grass turned yellow and brittle as paper. The cattle grew thin. The well water dropped low enough that Silas could hear the echo of his own voice when he shouted down the shaft. Samuel was 7, Charlotte was 3, and Silas, faced with the possibility of losing everything he had built, did what he had always done before Clara arrived. He shut down, he closed up, he carried it alone. He worked from before dawn until after dark. He skipped meals. He answered Clara's questions with single syllables. He sat on the porch at night not to talk, but to stare at the sky, looking for clouds that never came. The distance between them, the distance they had spent months erasing, began to widen again, and Clara could feel him retreating into the lonely fortress he had built around himself years ago, the fortress that had nearly destroyed him before she arrived. She confronted him after the children were asleep. Standing in the kitchen, her arms at her sides, her voice carrying not anger, but something more honest. Pain. You are pushing me out. You are turning back into the man who fired his gun at the sky alone. But you are not alone anymore, Silas. You have me. Let me help. You do not understand. Then make me understand. I walked 4,000 miles alone. I nursed a man with a gunshot wound. I faced down the man who tried to own me. I am not fragile, Silas Callaway, and you know it. Silas slept on the porch that night, too stubborn to go back inside, too proud to admit she was right. But when he lay down on the hardboards, he found that Clara had already placed a blanket and a pillow there because she knew him. She knew exactly what he would do, and she had prepared for it, and that small act of understanding broke through his stubbornness more effectively than any argument could have. In the morning, he came inside and found her at the stove. She had brewed coffee and laid out a slice of bread made from the last of their flour. His cup was in its usual place. His chair was pulled out. She stood with her back to him, pretending to wash a dish that was already clean. I am sorry, Silas said. Clara turned. For what? For thinking I had to carry everything alone. For forgetting that I promised to share this life with you, all of it, not just the good parts. Clara crossed the room and placed her hand on his chest directly over his heart in the same spot where she had placed it the night he told her he loved her. The mountain does not care, she said, but I do. Silas bent and kissed her forehead, the gesture that had become their private ritual, more meaningful than any other kiss could be. I am not worthy of you, he whispered. Do not ever say that again, Silas Callaway. You are worthy of everything. They made a plan together. Sold part of the herd before prices dropped further. Diversified with chickens and pigs that needed less grazing. Took a short-term loan against the land. The plan worked. The drought broke, and the lesson stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Never fight alone when there is someone who wants to fight beside you. We will get through this. In 1887, Josiah's nightmares began to ease. He had discovered wood carving, starting with simple toys for Samuel and Charlotte, and the art became his meditation, his healing. The blade on pine, each careful stroke creating form from formlessness. Deer and bears and horses and eagles emerging from raw blocks of wood as though they had been waiting inside all along. It was Josiah's way of processing what no words could reach. He never married. Clara asked him once gently whether he ever wanted to find someone. Josiah thought for a long time before answering the way he always thought, carefully and thoroughly, as though tracking something through a deep timber. I have a family, he said. I have the mountain. I have wood to carve. Some men need less than that. I am one of them. Clara nodded. Not everyone required romantic love to be whole. Josiah found his completeness in the role of beloved uncle, teaching the children to read animal tracks, to identify birds by their song, to respect the wilderness that had shaped him. Benjamin was born in 1888, their third child. Joyful, mischievous, carrying Caleb's energy in a smaller package. When Benjamin was 7, he watched Caleb sell a horse at the Elkhorn market and observed with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who does not yet know that adults are supposed to be smarter. Uncle Caleb should have waited 2 more weeks. Roundup prices always go up. Caleb's jaw dropped. Silas shrugged. He takes after his mother. On a warm September evening in 1890, Silas and Clara sat on the porch in the ritual they had maintained through all the years and all the changes. Samuel 11 was trying to teach Charlotte 7 how to catch a chicken with results that were more entertaining than effective. Benjamin, too, was crawling across the yard with the unstoppable determination that would define his character. Josiah sat in his corner, carving a small horse for Benjamin. From the house next door came the sound of Caleb and Emily laughing about something that no one else would have found funny. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked the question she always asked when she caught Silas in a contemplative mood. "About the night I fired my gun at the sky. How desperate I was. How alone." He gestured at everything around them. The children. The houses. The cattle on the hillside. Josiah in his corner. The laughter from Caleb's home. "I could never have imagined this." Clara took his hand. "I think about my journey too sometimes. About the girl on that stagecoach scared and not knowing where she was going. About the first time I opened my eyes and saw your face in the lamplight. You were so big I thought the ceiling had come down." She laughed. "And then you said I would be all right, and somehow I believed you. This is where you belong." The years passed in the rhythm of seasons and growth. Samuel rode his first solo cattle drive at 16, and Silas stood on the porch watching his son disappear over the hill on horseback. Clara beside him, her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember when you were 16, she asked. 16 and alone, and certain I would die on this mountain by myself. My son is 16 and loved, and knows the way home. That is all the difference in the world. 20 years, 1898. A quiet dinner on the porch, just the two of them, the children grown enough to give their parents an evening alone. 20 years, Clara said. Remember the first week when you were trying so hard to keep your distance? I remember you finding wildflowers on your windowsill and pretending not to know who put them there. I remember you saying, "You can stay," in a voice that sounded like a man trying his hardest not to hope. I was trying my hardest not to hope, because I knew that if I hoped and you left, it would destroy me. We were both fools, Clara said, taking his hand across the table. Lucky fools. Samuel married in 1901. Charlotte completed her nursing training in San Francisco and returned to open a clinic in Elkhorn. Benjamin, who had inherited his mother's head for numbers and his uncle Caleb's love of horses, began building the ranch's horse breeding operation into something that would outlast them all. Silas and Clara retired from the daily management of the ranch in 1910, turning control over to Samuel. They traveled to San Francisco to visit Charlotte, their first major journey together, since Clara had come west more than 30 years before. The city amazed them for 2 weeks and exhausted them for the same 2 weeks. I think we are definitely mountain people, Clara said on the train home. The city was lovely, but I missed the quiet, missed the horizon. Missed the porch, Silas added. Clara smiled. Every important conversation we have ever had happened on that porch. The first confession, the proposal. Every argument and every reconciliation. Every piece of good news and every piece of bad. If those porch boards could talk, they would write the thickest book in Montana, Silas finished, and they both laughed. The laughter of two people who had known each other long enough to complete each other's sentences and deeply enough to sit together in silence without needing to fill it. Emily died of pneumonia in the winter of 1912. Caleb, 56 years old, lost his smile for the first time in his life. He sat on the porch of his own house and stared at the empty chair where she used to sit, and the light that had always burned in his amber eyes dimmed to something barely visible. Silas came to sit beside him. He did not speak, did not offer platitudes or philosophy. He simply sat there shoulder to shoulder with his youngest brother and let his presence say what words could not. The way Clara had once sat beside Josiah at 3 in the morning after a nightmare. The way Josiah had sat beside Silas in the years after their parents died. The Callaways did not heal with words. They healed with presence. Winter always ends, Clara told Caleb softly one evening when she brought him supper he had not asked for. And Caleb looked up at her and recognized the words that Silas had spoken to her on a wagon ride home from Elkhorn so many years ago, words that had become part of the family's shared language, passed from person to person like a torch in the dark. He nodded. He ate the supper. And slowly over months the smile returned, smaller, sadder, but still warm. 40 years, October 1918. Silas and Clara sat on the porch in the chairs that faced west, the same direction they had always faced, watching the sunset paint the bitterroots, in shades they had seen 10,000 times and never tired of seeing. Silas was nearing 70. Clara was in her early 60s. Their hair was silver. Their faces were lined with the map of every year they had lived on this mountain. Their backs were not as straight as they once were, and the walk from the house to the barn took longer than it used to. But their hands found each other with the ease of long practice, the way they had found each other every evening for 4 decades without looking, without reaching, as naturally as breathing. 40 years since I collapsed on a dirt road in Montana, Clara said. Since I fired my gun at the sky and God sent me a Boston girl who barely reached my chest and had a will made of iron, Silas replied. Do you ever think about everything that had to go exactly right for us to find each other? Clara asked. If I had not broken the engagement, if Caleb had not written that letter, if the stagecoach axle had not snapped, if I had not been foolish enough to walk, if Tom Fisher had taken a different road that day. I used to think about that, Silas admitted, especially in the early years. I would lie awake and think about all the ways we might have missed each other. But then I stopped. Because whether you call it fate, or bad, or just insane luck, we found each other. And that is all that matters. Clara leaned into his shoulder, the gesture so familiar that their bodies had long since formed grooves for each other. His shoulder knew the exact weight of her head. Her head knew the exact angle of his shoulder. 40 years of the same posture, on the same porch, watching the same sunset. And every time still beautiful. Around them, the ranch hummed with life. 7 grandchildren playing in the yard, loud and happy, full of the energy that Silas remembered from Caleb's youth. From Samuel's house nearby, the sound of a violin. Not Caleb playing anymore, his fingers stiff with age, but Samuel's oldest child learning the Scottish melody that had become a Callaway tradition. Josiah sat in his corner of the porch, 65 years old, his hair white, but his green eyes still sharp as cut glass, carving an eagle for the newest great-grandchild. The wings spread wide, every feather detailed with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years turning raw wood into art. Caleb was in the meadow, 62, teaching a grandchild to ride a young horse, his laughter still carrying across the yard, still warm, though it held a minor key it had not held before Emily died. 200 cattle on the hillside now, where once there had been 40. Horses in the new barn that Benjamin had built. Lamplight glowing from 3 houses on the mountainside, where once there had been one. Silas looked at it all, the land he had cleared, the houses he had built, the cattle he had raised, the family he had grown, and he spoke. You know what I am most grateful for? Not the ranch, though I am proud of it. Not the children and grandchildren, though they bring me more joy than I can say. It is that I got to share all of it with you, that I never had to face any of it alone again. You gave me that, Clara. From the morning you opened your eyes in my bed, looked up at me, and asked if my kindness had a price. No woman had ever spoken to me like that. No woman had ever needed to. Clara laughed through her tears. I did not ride to this ranch. I collapsed on a road and was carried here. Tell the story right, Silas Callaway. Do not make me more heroic than I was. You are more heroic than you know, Silas replied. And his voice, after 40 years, after winters and droughts and sleepless nights with sick children, still softened when he spoke to her, still warmed when she laughed, still changed because of her in ways that no one else on earth could cause. Clara, tears sliding quietly down her cheeks, said, You gave me the same thing, a home, a purpose, a family. You never tried to change me, never tried to make me into someone I was not. That is the greatest gift anyone can receive. Built this with our own hands. They sat in silence as the stars emerged over the Montana sky, wider than any cathedral, brighter than any city lamp, and quieter than any prayer. Two people who had walked through an entire life together and were still here hand in hand on the porch they had built with wood and sweat and love. Clara passed away in her sleep on a spring morning in 1932. She was 76 years old. Her hand was in Silas's hand where it had been every night for 53 years. Their children, Samuel and Charlotte and Benjamin, stood around the bed. Josiah stood by the window, one hand resting on the framed photograph of their parents that Clara had hung on the wall decades ago. Four people he had loved most in this world together in one room. Caleb, 76, wept, silently, without restraint. The way he had wept at his own wedding watching his brother marry the woman his letter had brought across a continent. The day after the funeral, Silas sat alone on the porch. For the first time in 53 years, the chair beside him was empty. Josiah, 79, his hair pure white, but his step still silent, came out and sat next to his brother without a word. Two old men sitting together in the kind of silence that only a lifetime of shared experience can create. She would scold me if I sat here feeling sorry for myself, Silas said. She would scold you and make you drink coffee, Josiah replied. Silas laughed, a real laugh, because that was exactly what Clara would have done. Silas lived 3 more years. Every day he sat on the porch and told stories about Clara to any grandchild or great-grandchild who would listen. He told them about the girl from Boston who walked 4,000 miles to become a mail-order bride. He told them about the night she took command of 3 enormous men and saved Josiah's life with knowledge from books and iron from her soul. He told them about the time she negotiated a cattle price so effectively that the seller looked like he had been run over by a wagon. He told them about the wildflowers on the windowsill and the book his mother had left in the night of the first snowstorm when 4 strangers became a family over a pot of hot soup. And every story ended the same way. I prayed for companionship. God sent Clara, more than everything I dared to ask for. Josiah died 4 months before Silas. Quietly, in his afternoon nap on the porch, his carving knife still in his hand, a wooden rabbit half finished for the newest great-grandchild. Silas, when he heard, said only this: he went the way he lived, silent and at home. Silas Calloway died in October of 1935, 57 years to the month after the night he had fired his gun at the sky and prayed for someone to share his life. He died on the porch watching the Montana sunset, the same sunset he had shared with Clara 10,000 times. His last thought was of her smile, the first smile she had given him when she woke from the fever, weak and embarrassed and brave in a way that the whole world could not have extinguished. Caleb, the last of the brothers, held Silas's hand at the end. "Do you remember the letter I wrote?" Caleb said. "I wrote, 'If that is good enough for you, then you are good enough for us.' I did not know then that I was writing the truest thing I would ever write." Silas squeezed his brother's hand, gently, once, and then let go. Caleb lived to 88, passing in 1944, and until his final breath, he told the story. The story of his eldest brother and the prayer and the girl from Boston and the wildflowers on the windowsill and the night in the cabin when Josiah laughed. He told it with his trademark wide grin and his father's amber eyes glowing warm every time he spoke their names. They are buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch they built together. Silas and Clara in the center, Josiah on the right, Caleb on the left. Emily behind Caleb where she belongs. The headstone is simple, just names and dates and 2 words that say everything. Answered prayers. The ranch still stands. The Calloway name still marks the gate. And on quiet October evenings, when the light slants gold across the Montana landscape and the air holds the particular quality of autumn, people swear they can see them still. 2 figures on the old porch. 3 actually, because Josiah is always there in his corner, carving wood in the silence. Hands intertwined, watching the sunset together. Still in love after all those years. Still grateful for the desperate prayer that started it all, for the letter a younger brother wrote in secret, and for the small, fierce, extraordinary woman who walked 4,000 miles to become the home that a lonely man on a mountain needed more than he ever knew. This is where she belonged, always. And if you listen closely on those still evenings when the wind dies down and the stars begin to emerge over the Bitterroot Peaks, you can almost hear it. A deep voice, rough with age and softened by decades of love, saying the words that became the heartbeat of an entire family. Coffee is ready.